Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
The new documentary, The Body Politic, follows Baltimore Mayor Brandon Scott. He's the youngest mayor of the city in more than 100 years.
You cannot go anywhere in Baltimore without seeing the aftermath of gun violence, a disease we have been unable to cure. This is not normal. Most people do not live like this. Why must we? It is unacceptable and we must change it. My entire life, I've heard from our elders that they can't wait for my generation to produce a leader that is ready to take the reins, stand on their shoulders, and take us to higher heights. I am that leader.
The film centers Scott's campaign to reduce gun violence in Baltimore. In 2019, there were more homicides in Baltimore than in New York City, according to the film. That's in spite of the fact that New York City has more than 14 times as many residents as Baltimore. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Today we're learning about young leaders who are making change, from fighting gun violence in Baltimore to promoting civility in our national politics. Later we'll hear about an organization that's connecting young political leaders across the aisle. But up first, Gabriel Francis Paz Goodenough. He's director and producer of the new documentary film, The Body Politic. Gabriel, it's great to have you on Disrupted.
Thank you.
And before we get into this film, which is a powerful film and so important, I'm curious, why Baltimore? Tell our listeners why Baltimore is so important to you and why you decided to make it the centerpiece of this film.
I'm a third generation Baltimorean, son of working class parents. My mom was a nurse and dad is a carpenter, and this is the city that gave me life. There is no non-human thing on the planet that I love more than this city of Baltimore, Maryland, where I was born and raised. And while I've spent my life, making films, mostly documentary films for other folks and traveling around the world, and some of those projects here in Baltimore, about 5 years ago, I got sick. I got cancer. I lost a big chunk of my right leg. And it sort of ended the ability for me to do what I love, which is like handheld verite cinematography. It's like the jazz music of filmmaking. It's improvisational. It's go with the flow. I loved it. And when I was in the hospital, I decided I wanted to keep doing film and make my own film. So I applied for a grant, and we got that grant, and that was the beginning, as they say. So were many grants more and lots of credit card debt more and a bunch of other things. But here we are, and I really, out of my own feelings with my own mortality, I really wanted to understand this thing that has been affecting my city for the entire time I've been alive, which is violence, specifically gun violence.
Yeah. Listening to you talk about your journey and having this thing that you loved taking away, but then creating a new path. In many ways, Gabriel, sounds like the city of Baltimore itself. How do you make a way out of no way and find purpose in something that for many people can be painful, can be contentious? That's the story of Baltimore. Baltimore in popular culture for a lot of people is The Wire or The Corner, or maybe they know about Baltimore club music. What is it about Baltimore that you think people outside of the city don't understand or don't appreciate about this place you love?
Wow, that's a beautiful question. I think there's many Baltimores all over the world. It could be St. Louis, it could be Detroit, it could be Gaza. It could be anywhere in the world that people sort of get a condensed, abridged, watered down version of what that city's like. And, I guess the takeaway that people have had about Baltimore has been that it's a dangerous, violent city that you shouldn't enter. And really, for me, what was essentially important was to show that there is life here. There is and are people here that are trying to heal, that are trying to do the right thing. Like in any place that is notorious for something like violence, you can't generalize. It's not the whole population. There's a lot of life here. There's a lot of love here, and there's a lot of people that are trying to work for change.
Let's get into the film. It traces the beginning of Baltimore Mayor Brandon Scott's first term in office, and that term is unfolding against a really interesting backdrop. Share with our listeners the title of the film, Body Politic, and how it connects into this story that you are exploring of Brandon Scott's entry and also the city.
Yeah, the body politic is a term that goes all the way back to, the beginning of the Western idea of democracy. And it's this idea, this metaphor that democracy is like a human body, right? Um, and that all parts of the human body need to be healthy for the whole corpus, the whole body of the political organism to be healthy. That each and every single part of our community, of our democracy, of our city must be healthy. And if someone is unhealthy, if someone is getting hurt or shot or killed, that hurts all of us, and that we need the whole body to be healthy to have a healthy democracy. That was the idea of the title of the film, and I think it really, really serves the message of the film.
Brandon Scott is running for office in 2020, which was a time of tremendous upheaval for people across the country in many different ways. We have the start of the COVID-19 pandemic that shut down many things and also created even more tension and confusion. It is also this time of massive uprisings against violence, but violence not at the hands of citizens against citizens, but violence against the state and unarmed people, whether it's George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, so many other names that we could mention. How does that context shape your approach to this film and of telling this story of if any part of the body is unhealthy or suffering, it has an impact on the entire whole?
Let me just back it up just a little bit in the story. For us, we went in thinking we were making an election film, right?
Mm.
There's an amazing film that Cory Booker is in called Street Fight, and I've always loved that film. There's so many political documentaries, War Room, just so many things about political documentaries that I love, and I was really interested with the team here. Almost all of us are Baltimoreans, of making a film about this election that was happening. This is before COVID, before George Floyd, of 5 candidates running an election where the main issue in that election was different avenues of gun violence reduction, right? So we followed 5 candidates and shot hundreds and hundreds of hours of footage, and very much thought we were making an election film. But COVID happened, George Floyd was murdered, and the whole world changed, and so did our film. So at that point, it became very clear. In those days around the murder of George Floyd, the election was about 7 days later, almost to the day, and the election ended and Brandon had lost on the first night. He was down by 3,000 votes. It took 7 days to manually count the votes to show that he had actually won by 3,000. And it's really because of everything that happened centering around George Floyd and all of the movement and all the political eruption happening in Baltimore and the world that really pushed Brandon to the win. And at that point, it really became clear to us that we needed to follow Brandon into office. We needed to see what change and maybe dysfunction look like from the inside. So at that point, we started making a whole second film, right? So we ended up with 732 hours of footage, and we ended up cutting both films. We had no idea what we were doing, in terms of what film are we going to make. So the film that you see, much more focuses on Brandon's first year in office and the difficulty of the political system. But it was just, it's a process. It's a process of a lot of confusion and doubt as a filmmaker. And then you you test it with audiences and you test it with yourself, and you come up with the best and most important story to tell. And I think that's the one we told. I hope that sort of answers your question.
It does. And before we talk about the difficulties of the system, what it means to attack a system while being a part of a system, and all the layers of that, I'm curious about something you just mentioned, Gabriel, which is that most of the people making this film are Baltimoreans. And you and I were joking at the start of our conversation about that authenticity, not just the sound of people from Baltimore, but the feel of that. How did having this group of creators who are so connected to the city, how did that shape how you wanted to tell the story? Not just what you wanted to tell, but the authenticity that you wanted to bring to really honor the people of Baltimore and this experience of the election. How did that shape your creative process here?
This is our home. This is where we live. All of us, and including me, we've lost people to this disease of violence. Thankfully, me less than many others who are on the film. But our friends, our loved ones, our families, we have to answer to what this film is, and for the rest of our life, we'll have to live with it, right? So it's very important to us that this film not only honestly portrays the story, but doesn't hammer down and use the story tool of trauma and violence as a way to suck people into the narrative, right? Like, we made a whole film about violence where we don't show one act of violence, right? One of the most violent things in the film is probably listening to the murder of George Floyd, but it's only in audio. So it was just really important to us that this film was about, in a lot of ways, dissecting the problem and understanding it better. And hopefully, we didn't think we were going to come away with an answer, but it was still extremely important to us that this is where we live.
Coming up, more with Gabriel Francis Paz Goodenough. He'll talk about the problems of focusing on short-term political solutions.
There are long-term changes that are created by mass incarcerating human beings that then will show up 2 years later, 3 years later, 4 years later, 5 years later.
And later, the president and CEO of the nonprofit Future Caucus talks about how her organization is working to reduce polarization.
Any one issue is huge and important in itself, but if we don't fix that root issue of polarization, we're never going to have the right tools in our toolbox to tackle them all.
This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're hearing about young people working for political change. We're still joined by Gabriel Francis Paz Goodenough. He's the director and producer of the documentary, The Body Politic. The film follows Baltimore Mayor Brandon Scott as he tries to curb gun violence in his hometown. The film also shows what it's like to see firsthand when systems fail and to still have the will and courage to change them.
As a young black man grew up in Baltimore, I was once the victim of zero-tolerance policing. But now, I'm the commander-in-chief of the Baltimore Police Department.
Ask Gabriel how Mayor Scott's proximity to violence influenced the film.
Yeah, it's there's just been so much just rhetoric in the last, 7 or 8 years, whether it's defund the police or all of these different, sort of gotcha kind of taglines. But the amazing thing is, in the film, we have a mayor that grew up during the war on drugs, during Zero Tolerance. I mean, The Wire, which is a show that I day played on and I worked on as a camera assistant. I mean, this is about a mayor, Martin O'Malley, that arrested 100,000 Baltimoreans a year. The city only has 600,000 people, so 1 in 6 Baltimoreans a year was arrested. There's all these things that were done very much in my lifetime, and not by Republican leaders, right? By Democratic administrations. Um, to really use the criminal justice system and police in general as the way to deal with high levels of crime, be they violent crime, be they drugs. And it didn't work. The numbers show they didn't work, right? And they also have long-term issues, right? And so Brandon is getting into office and really understanding that. And the really unique thing about Baltimore is the executive office in Baltimore, the office of the mayor, has direct control and power over the police commissioner, right? The police commissioner is 100% hired at the will of the mayor, right? So Brandon at this time is working with a police commissioner who is actually already in, but a police commissioner who is very, very open and receptive to this type of long-term change, not just using the police force as a reactionary tool to stop crime, having the police force as part of a team to be able to keep crime from happening in the long term, right? So he's looking at stuff totally differently, and it's just for me it was fantastic to watch, because it wasn't like, here, I'm anti-police, I hate the police, we're going to take money from the police. It's like, no, I have a really good relationship with the police. However, what we've done and how we've used them as a military force is not working. We need to use all of our community, this whole idea of the body politic. We need to use all of our resources as a way to stop this problem of violence that is happening in our country.
A real strength of this film and your approach, Gabriel, is that you do show all of those parts. That yes, there are the formal structures of people who are elected or appointed into these positions, but there's a real strength and a real power of the everyday people who are in the streets, who are trying to protect kids, who are saying young people in Baltimore deserve a future. And activists who are working through their own pain and loss to affirm power and agency that says we're not just sitting here waiting for someone to save us. We are going to step up. Tell us more about the role of activists and community organizers in the story you're telling about the efforts to reduce violence in Baltimore.
100%. So the film, leaves Brandon's office at multiple points, and we go out into the community, into the streets of Baltimore, and we follow a few different characters, but two characters that are really fascinating to me and taught me a lot are Erica Bridgeford, who is the leader of something in the film called Baltimore Ceasefire. It's now called the Baltimore Peace Movement. And her group hold peace weekends. Every 3 months, a year, they hold weekends where they ask Baltimoreans to really focus on healing and health and not hurting themselves or hurting each other. These weekends have been shown to drop violence 40%, right? Her group also goes to all homicide sites in the city of Baltimore, and they bless those sites, right? And the idea is that imagine a city which has, it's like when you're driving on the highway and you see the memorials built to people that have died in car accidents. Imagine a city that's just full of them, right? And imagine you as a victim or a loved one of something involved in shooting, constantly being re-traumatized by those sites. So what they're trying to do is go back and bring different energy into those sites. And it really works. It's amazing to see the community interaction when they're there, saging the sites and cleansing them and bringing a different energy back in. So that, just in terms of Erica's ability to use personal willpower and positivity in her group as a force to be able to heal, it was amazing. We also follow Dante Johnson and a group of violence interrupters in a community called Bel-Air Edison in Baltimore. And they're guys, formerly incarcerated individuals who have returned and back to their own communities and are trying to help people that might be, heading down a pathway of either being a victim of violence or either being a perpetrator, and help them figure out ways to not use violence as a tool, and also to, maybe steer their lives to places or situations where they don't even have to worry about violence at the level that they are. So the community we follow with Dante, actually, while we're filming, they celebrated one of their first years ever without a homicide. So we're out there in the streets seeing these people that are true heroes use different tools to bring about long-term change to violence reduction. And that's the key. This violence issue is a long-term issue, and the medicine on the treatment for it needs to be long-term too. And that's a lot of what I don't think was working with just having the police as the only tool to solve these problems.
One of the most compelling scenes in this film is when the mayor is speaking to a mother who says, "My son will never walk again." And you can physically see the impact on the mayor of hearing that, but you can hear also the pain in this mother's voice. And as someone, Gabriel, who has lost loved ones to violence, who very much understands how gun violence, whether it results in a murder or results in the loss of innocence, has this impact that ripples across. The power of this film is that you hear activists who are affirming that people in Baltimore are entitled to joy, they are entitled to health and wholeness, and that the people of Baltimore are working for that. What do you hope people learn about this city you love, but also about the power of community to stand up and say, we deserve more, we're going to demand more, and we can get there together?
Wow. I think you said it pretty amazingly. I will try my best to follow up. I think as a whole in the film, just generally us as a body politic of the United States of America, I think we constantly are in this situation, specifically with our leaders or politicians, where we are seduced or accept these sort of short-term gags, that these things will work, right? That if we just do this is going to work. Just change this law or throw people in prison or whatever. And it doesn't work like that, right? Like, it's just like raising a human being. It takes years, right? It takes years to raise a healthy, loving, constructive human being, right? It takes years to learn how to talk and walk and all of that stuff. And I think that's a lot of the takeaway that I got from the film, is that it does work, exactly like Eric says, it does work. And in 50 years, people are going to be amazed that it was like this. And they're going to be amazed that there were people out here fighting to make the change. But we have to focus on that, right? And we can't be seduced by these short-term desires for solutions that are reactionary, right? Like it's almost like every time crime went up in Baltimore or multiple cities in this country, you get a tough on crime, quote unquote, mayor, and he or she arrests more people, and then crime goes down, maybe for the temporary, right? But there are long-term changes that are created by mass incarcerating human beings that then will show up 2 years later, 3 years later, 4 years later, 5 years later, right? So we really need to get out of that. We need to figure out how to make long-term healthy change in this country. And I'm just proud that kind of change is starting here in Baltimore, that it's people in the community solving the problems of their community themselves, right? It's really amazing. Nobody's coming in from Ivy League universities and telling these people to do this or that. People are out here living the experience and making the change themselves. And it's beautiful to watch.
This is a brave film that, as you say, reminds us that people know what they need. And more of us need to be humble and listen to what communities need, but also respect what they're doing. Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you.
That was Gabriel Francis Paz Goodenough. He's director and producer of the documentary film, The Body Politic. You can stream the film via PBS's website. Coming up, we'll learn about an organization working with young political leaders.
For young people who might think of themselves as unqualified to be in office, I would say look around. If there is even one person who you think is in elected office who you don't think is qualified, then I got news for you.
This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're hearing about young leaders who are pushing for political change. 80% of U.S. adults say that Americans are greatly divided on most important values. That's according to a Gallup poll released in August. Now, that is the highest percentage since 1993, when the question was first asked. Layla Zayden is trying to combat that division. She's president and CEO of Future Caucus. The organization brings together young lawmakers to collaborate across party lines. Layla, it's wonderful to have you on Disrupted.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
You know, the idea of collaboration in general, but especially collaborating across party lines and across generations, unfortunately seems so novel in our current political climate. Share with our listeners how your organization is bringing people together.
So we started with sort of this radical idea of what if we imagined that other people were not evil or were not so different from ourselves. And from that one nugget birthed this organization, Future Caucus, which formerly was called Millennial Action Project. And we thought if we could help the youngest members of the legislature, young people who were just stepping into public service, to public office in Congress and at the state level, build relationships, just build human-to-human friendships and strong working relationships with other people along a generational identity and not a partisan identity, that might disrupt some of the artificial barriers that keep us divided. And so for the past 10 years, we've been working in 34 states and Congress to connect any young person, Democrat, Republican, Independent, who serves in elected office to one another across party lines. And from that has resulted some really amazing things and some really amazing friendships.
One of the things that I think is particularly poignant about the work that you do is that you're also supporting legislators across the states, where we tend to see a lot more diversity and nuance when it comes to views, preferences, and backgrounds. How critical is that work in building those relationships that you mentioned of seeing how people can have an impact right where they are and not just at the national level?
Yeah, we're a big country, right? And there's just a few hundred people who serve at the congressional level who have to make decisions on behalf of a huge, huge number of people. The more local you get, it's just normal. The more connected you are to the constituents that you represent, because there's just fewer of them. And so it is a lot easier to have your finger on the pulse of what's going on and to even be able to have conversations with most of your constituents. And so we see at the state level, at the more local levels, less of the polarization and gridlock that really sort of paralyzes folks at a more national level. And because folks, again, at the more local levels seem to be a little bit more connected, there seems to be a little bit less polarization, we're able to get results and see them govern more effectively. And especially from young people who I think are running because they have an appetite to make government work a little bit more effectively than they've experienced in their lifetimes.
I'm curious what it is about this work that appeals to you. you are not new to organizing, to getting people involved in the political process, to shaping policy and to bridging these divides. And so taking on this awesome task at this point in your career, what is it that makes you say, this is where I want to really plug in and have the opportunity to build?
Oh my gosh. So I totally ended up here by accident. I did not see myself trying to heal America's divides when I was a little girl. I actually was really passionate about diplomacy. My family is originally from Morocco. Most of my family still lives there. My dad's there. And as a first-gen immigrant, I really was curious about the things that divide countries and the things that enable us to work together. And so that's what I studied. My first job out of college was actually working in U.S. politics as an organizer, working with young people on college campuses to connect them with policy solutions and to galvanize them around things that would make their lives better, things impacting the affordability of higher education, public safety, jobs. And it just struck me that some of the problems that we were trying to fix, we weren't necessarily proposing an affirmative vision of what could be better, but we were spending so much time trying to tear something else down to say this other thing is worse and you should be afraid of it. And I felt really empty, right? I thought that it was still incredibly important to think, with this like diplomacy lens on how do we bring people together to make collaboration more effective? And if I'm not doing it at the international level, how do I apply that domestically here in the US? With this work, we're not just tearing something down. We're not just breaking something and trying to make people afraid. We're builders. We're creating a better path forward. And for me, I get to wake up every single morning and work with the next generation of America's leaders, people who are going to build the democracy in the world that we live in 10, 15, 20 years from now, and whose choices that they're making today are impacting that. And that's incredibly exciting. And I get to work with just so many amazing people. So that really fires me up and gets me out of bed every morning.
You are a builder and you're also a disruptor. And one of the things that you are disrupting is this notion that public service is something for other people, or that you have to wait to become a public servant. You are investing in people, young people, to say, you're the leaders, not the leaders of tomorrow, the leaders of today, because we need you right now. What do you hear from those young leaders in terms of the types of policies and things that they're concerned about? What are you hearing from that cadre?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things that is a barrier for people running for office is we don't really see a ton of young people amplified in the media who are governing in this sort of like effective consensus builder way. Really, just across all generations, the people that tend to get the most airtime are the flamethrowers or the people who are saying outlandish things or who say random things on Twitter or X to get clicks. And that can really paint a distorted vision of what it is to serve and who it is that serves. And so a big part of what Future Caucus does is we amplify the young leaders in our network to prove that there are incredible, innovative, effective leaders out there who are getting things done. And that permission structure, just sort of showing people that there is a model for success for them, I think is a really important way to inspire young people today that public service is an honorable position. It is a place where they can have impact and where they won't be alone. One stat that I love to share is at the state level, right now, there's only about 25% of the legislature that is millennial or Gen Z. So you compare that to it's 43% sort of population wide. So 25% in the state house, but they are responsible for authoring 40% of all bipartisan legislation that gets signed into law, not just introduced, but signed into law by the governor. And so when they get into office, they're effective, they're solving problems. And a big part of our job is almost helping young people's perception of what it is to serve evolve into what we believe it could be, it should be, and it is.
When President Joe Biden decided that he would not seek re-election amid questions about his age and whether he could do this, A lot of people had the difficult conversation about what succession planning looks like, what pathways to elected office may look like, and how we carve out a space where we're not telling young lawmakers, just wait your turn, but we're actually affirming their ability to work where they are. And at the same time, Layla, I have heard from some elder statespeople that they feel like they're being pushed to the side in state legislatures, in local politics, by an emphasis on bringing younger voices into the process. What do you say in response to that when people say, well, should we be organizing younger lawmakers or this next generation of lawmakers? What do you say in response?
I mean, listen, for the longest time, I was really annoyed because I had to learn this new word to me that I think is popular across the country now, which is gerontocracy. And gerontocracy means a system of government ruled by the olds. And we kept talking about, oh, we live in a gerontocracy. We live in a gerontocracy. What's the next generation? How do we pass the mantle? And if we're not investing and organizing young people, then that's not going to change. It doesn't happen overnight. We have to create and organize and support the next generation to get the experience, to build the networks, to get the wins, to build the confidence, and to rise in order to have a deep bench of people in both parties. I think it's really important to really thoughtfully invest in a sustainable and sustained way. And so for us, it's critical. It's critical if you don't have an early start. And we think, starting especially at like the more local level and more municipal levels when people are just starting out in their career is really important. If you don't have that, then you're never going to get to a moment where you're seeing people in leadership roles, people who are chairing committees, speakers of the House, who are under 60 years old. It just doesn't happen overnight.
You have said before that political polarization is one of the greatest threats, not just to our democracy, but to our society and our global society as a connection. Mm-hmm. Share with us why you believe that, and also what civility means for young people that you are building with.
I love that you brought this up because it's true. Political polarization is the single greatest threat to our future. If the people who are in charge of making our decisions cannot figure out how to move forward, sure, you may have a really different set of ideas about the tactics or the path to solve a problem. But if you're not even getting to sit at the same table to agree on the problem and commit to a shared path forward, then the problem is just going to get kicked down the road. The can gets kicked, and then young people get left holding the bag. And for things like our changing climate, economic inequality, for a broken justice system, it's not like it's the same problem, but just 10 years later, it gets worse. And so political polarization is a direct root cause of growing inequality in the future. And I think that is why it is urgent to tackle it today. Any one issue is huge and important in itself, but if we don't fix that root issue of polarization, we're never going to have the right tools in our toolbox to tackle them all.
And I have a teenage daughter who I would describe as being perpetually frustrated that people can't put party aside to focus on those things that matter. And we have these great discussions about what's happening in politics. And she'll say, why is it really a partisan issue to say that kids in schools should be supported in their mental health, or that what's happening with our climate affects all of us, regardless of party ideology and things of that notion? How do you see young people approaching things like bipartisanship, of really working across aisles now, not just an aisle, aisles to say, we've got a common interest, let's get there and figure out how we get there together?
Well, so often we get stuck because we come at bipartisanship backwards. We say, I have this perfectly laid out 10-point plan, and these are the exact steps that I'm going to follow in order to, get more equitable health care. And this is what we have to do. And then the person on the other side of the aisle says, no, well, this is my 10-point plan. And these are the things we have to do. And then you're stuck arguing about the 20 points that, that you want to move forward with. And instead, as you said, what if we agreed and sat down and said, we think it is important for everybody to have access to healthcare. How do we do that? What should we build together rather than, again, like this builder breaker paradigm that we talked about earlier? When you're just starting with your specific tactics and trying to negotiate from there, you're really trying to tear down and break the other person's idea versus starting from sort of a shared value and moving forward. And for us, what we've seen is the way to get to a comfort in sharing that value and having the conversation is it only happens if you have trust. So I'll give you an example from right here in Connecticut, where we've had a future caucus for the past 5 or 6 years now. And the first thing that they did when they launched the Future Caucus was not sit down and lay out all of their policy priorities. They just started by getting lunch together. They just got to know each other on a human level. They started to do events where they invited other young people in to learn from them. They did, I think they called it Politics and Pints, where they just had it, an open event at a brewery and people came and they got to hang out and learn from their lawmakers. And that started to help them build a sense of identity and a sense of familiarity with each other. And then together they were able to work, ultimately pass a successful piece of legislation to improve the lives and health of Connecticut's people with a focus on healthcare, with home care nurses and enhanced oversight over health data. And that doesn't happen, again, like they didn't come to the table saying, I have this like home nurse plan. They got to know each other. They built trust first. And we don't do that enough in politics. And I think it really would dramatically and radically disrupt the way that we solve problems.
What do you think the rest of us can learn from these young leaders that you are working with and inspired by? What should we be paying attention to and learning from them?
You mentioned earlier this notion of civility. And when most of us think about that word, we think about people being polite and having decorum, to quote a TikTok trend right now, like very demure, very mindful. And that to me is not really what civility means. Civility means having the ability to have honest conversations that respect the other person's intelligence and create space for them to respect you too. And that only happens if you've built up trust within each other. You cannot have civility without trust. Otherwise, you're just papering over real differences and you're not actually moving forward. You're just being quiet. And I think for young people today, we don't want to be quiet. We want to fix things. We're sick and tired of things being broken and the problems that really matter being passed over. And so for each of us, I think to maybe reframe our understanding or, how we use the word civility, how we think about what it means to have civil conversations and actually replace that with the word respect and the things that help you respect other people. And you can only control your own behaviors, right? So you control yourself. But I think if we each did that, that might create an environment in which we're not shying away from tough conversations. We're getting to the meat of things and we're building together.
Let me ask you this basic question, Layla. Is civility possible? The way that you describe civility as not a state of being, but really an action that we have to commit to all the time. Is civility possible in the U.S.?
It has to be. We have no choice. Conflict and disagreement and persuasion are not the opposite of civility, right? Political campaigns are about selling a vision for the future. And I think where politics gets ugly is when people try to take shortcuts and just try to undercut the other side or the other person's set of ideas. If you can lead with civility, if you can lead with joy, if you can lead with sort of what it takes to build, then yeah, I think it is possible within the context of even an electoral campaign where you are trying to persuade people that your vision is the vision to put their faith in, that you can do it while having integrity and while doing it in a way that ultimately connects with Americans.
I spend every day of my life professionally on a college campus, surrounded by amazing young people who are curious, who are committed, and are thinking about what a future can look like for us collectively, not just for themselves individually. And I secretly find myself saying to them, run for office, run for office. What do you say to young people, Layla, who are like, I don't know if that's the thing for me, or I don't know if it's the time for me to do that? What do you say to people who are curious about public service and office, but may not see themselves in this moment? What do you say?
Public service does not require any credentials or degrees. For young people who might think of themselves as unqualified to be in office, I would say look around. If there is even one person who you think is in elected office who you don't think is qualified, then I got news for you. This is a role where you can serve and where you can lead and you can have an impact. And it doesn't have to start with running for office without ever, attending a town hall meeting ever. Get involved. There's tons of ways to participate in building a healthier civic flywheel, from volunteering on a campaign to just being informed about the issues that are up for debate in your state legislature, knowing what all of the different elected positions are. There are thousands of elected positions across the country, not just president and Congress, but so many state and local roles, just even knowing what those are. And I think that if, like me, they are curious and prone to going down rabbit holes, taking those first baby steps, I think starts to open up a world where you can imagine yourself, where you see yourself belonging. And we've had 1,800 young elected leaders be a part of the Future Caucus Network. They won't be alone. They won't be the first. They won't be the only. It's a network that's growing and they can have impact.
Well, we are grateful for the ways that you are cultivating that network and reminding all of us what's possible in this great place that we call our country. Layla Zayden is president and CEO of Future Caucus, bringing together young lawmakers to collaborate across party lines. Thank you, Layla.
Thank you.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon Aiken, Meg Fitzgerald, and Meg Dalton. Our intern is Frankie Devevo. This episode was also produced by Wayne Edwards. Disrupted has more than 200 episodes highlighting change and change makers. With all those disruptions, you may not know where to start. So we made a playlist for you to give new listeners a sense of what this show is all about. You can find that playlist at ctpublic.org/disrupted. And you can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcast. And you can listen to new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.